No problem.
All right, we are
Yeah.
officially here.
Lighting here. Okay.
Yung Chang, welcome to Utah Valley University in lovely Orem, Utah.
Thank
We've
you
got a
for
group of,
having me.
like I said, there's about 30 or so people here, and we just finished the
Fantastic.
film, and so they are all very grateful for the lives they lead. And it's a fabulous film. It's mesmerizing. Thank you for sharing with us. And I got some questions for you.
Sure.
Oh, I just touched something in it. Okay. So it's always, documentaries are always about access. And from your story that you tell within the film, it seems like you went there with your grandfather, met some people, and then decided to come back, or how did it work that you decided that this would be a good documentary from that trip?
Yeah.
And then how did you end up meeting your characters?
So the initial spark for the film was oddly, firstly, and put it in context, this film is 10 years old now, and it was my first feature documentary. So at the tender age of my mid-20s, it was, I think I was sort of like a cynical filmmaker, and my parents, in fact, and my grandfather invited me on this trip to China to take a riverboat. And of course, being the impoverished filmmaker at the time, I just sort of like said, okay, let me come along. I had heard of the Three Gorges Dam and know the mythology along that river, and decided to tag along. I had the instinct that it would be interesting to bring a camera or something, because I felt like, just at that time, a film by Robert Altman had come out called Gosford Park. And
Right.
I was imagining this sort of upstairs, downstairs world. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And also just going into it, just a cruise at that moment. There was also an essay that I had read by David Foster Wallace about big mega cruise ships, and it kind of had sunk into me a little bit. And so I said, yeah, I was up for the adventure. So that was the initial journey, and it was, everything I expected it to be, and inspired me in many ways. Certainly you see it in the film, the initial gangway plank, or so not the gangway, the the port dock,
Right.
and the You Are My Sunshine, and all these songs that the marching band played immediately kicked off the dichotomy at the time of East meets West, and how at the time, which is not so long ago, I guess, in 2006 when I filmed. It's in years, it's not so long ago, but in China, it feels like a century ago. If you go back to China today, it's just so much more different. But anyway, at the time, it felt like, wow, this is another world, and it felt apocalyptic. It felt like Blade Runner. In fact, the scene in Chongqing, that landscape, was out of this world, and just the contrast between rich and poor was so striking at that time. So that was the spark that really inspired me. It took a while. Actually, the initial journey I went on with my family was in 2004, I think it was. So I had a little, at that time, maybe the audience isn't aware, there were things like digital DV tapes, and I had a Sony PD-150 camera, and you had to load the tape in and film, and
glorious SD.
That's right. That's right. And I documented as much as I could. It was, I honed in more on the tourists, and I did go below decks a little with the crew, but I was more focused on this culture of tourism, and the tourism of culture at the time. And then that was my takeoff from that trip. And then eventually I developed the project, you know, we can go into more detail if people are interested later, but I developed the project along and started getting the research money together and joining up with these producers in Montreal. And in fact, one of the producers was my former professor. So students flag that Dwayne could be a useful connection in the future.
It'll never happen.
But Daniel Cross was my producer, and along with a couple other guys, and they helped me a lot, greatly, to see the shape of the film and the potential for it to go beyond, you know, to kind of really place it in a time and place as this sort of epic film that could cover a lot of layers and themes, but also, you know, with a very focused story. And so that challenge was the biggest part, was finding the characters along the river. And in fact, I lucked out because I buddied up with this cruise line, Victoria Cruises, and their cruise ship company run out of Woodside, Queens in New York. And I got to know the owner's son, and he just gave me carte blanche to go in there, unprecedented access, fed me, put me up. I think he took pity on me, this, like, at the time long-haired, you know, struggling filmmaker. I think he's somewhere else. For some reason, I'm very gracious for his you know, support, and he just let me on that ship, and I just milked it for all I could. And through the cruise ship, they have a recruitment process where they hire new workers, that, you know, crew workers. There's a high turnaround on that cruise ship because it's tough work, very monotonous and repetitive work. You know, imagine going up and down the river and saying the same things over and over again. So I joined them on the recruitment trip, and I found these archetypes of characters I was looking for. And at the time in documentary, you know, I was following more than one subject. About a third of the way through the shoot, the initial production shoot, I determined who were the lead characters, so to speak, and they were Yushui and Jerry Chumbuyu, and then I kind of really pushed and developed that relationship, and their story.
Right. So that goes into one of my questions. Being a documentarian of sorts, I've done some, but sometimes you recreate things, and it felt, and just assuming, after watching it a few times, that some of the early stuff with the family was recreated or at least edited in a way that was recreated. Yeah. Did you ever have them go ahead and just act things out, or did you do that in the edit somehow?
Yeah, no, I never had them act things out, and I kind of fell into this process, and the process was, it was a very long getting to know everyone stage, and kind of breaking down the long-term investment I was going to make with the family. Sure. And you know, initially when I visited them, they thought I was just like from the news channel, and I was going to be there they're used to the idea of you know, 5-minute little news segment and then leaving. But then I would come back, and then you know, a year later I was still with them. So I think there was, in my way of working, it's very much a collaboration. I never write dialogue or recreate scenes, but I do set up the space for the evolution of a conversation, for example. So in the beginning of the film, there's a meal that they have around the dinner table. They have a few meals, but one of them was around the dinner table in the evening, and
schooling.
Yeah, and I think, you know, generally the process I would use is just, you know, pre-light a little, make sure the lighting is good, and then I would kind of throw questions to each of them. Not to put words in their mouths, but just to provoke a little conversation. Right. And because I don't, you can tell when it feels fake, and I didn't want fakeness. So I wanted genuine conversation. I knew, because I knew them so well and they understood what I was trying to go for, they were collaborative in the sense that they would engage in conversation. And I always believe, like, in the process of narrative storytelling, which this is, and it's, you know, we're making documentary, but documentary is the interpretation of reality, as I like to think. You have to provoke a moment to happen, you know, and sometimes, most oftentimes, they happen naturally. You know, the scene where at the end of the film where the father's carrying and moving the house, like, obviously I didn't set anything up there. That stuff happens naturally, and I think, but sometimes for the narrative you have to fill in the blanks, and there are these burning questions that the family will talk about. You know, I think if you were to be a real realist in documentary filmmaking, you could be someone like there's a Chinese filmmaker named Wang Bing, and Wang Bing makes these 8-hour epic documentaries, but he doesn't interfere, and he just lets it roll, and you could film a meal for 2 hours and nobody's talking. I mean, I think for me, the North American approach would be to kind of, you know, try to collaborate a little bit. So that was my process. And I think since that film, I've changed a lot in my process of how I would go about doing that. You know, we can talk about that later.
I'd like to hear. I'd like to know how you changed.
You know, I've made a couple Veritate films. So this I would consider a cinema verite or observational film.
Right.
And which they say it's like being a fly on the wall, but as we know, it's much more interactive than that. We're trying to push for story and get something out of scenes, but also creating our own kind of moral, ethical decisions of how far you want to push things. And I didn't want to, you know, like I said earlier, put words into people's mouths. So I would do this technique. Now I think I'm catering my directing much more to the subject matter. Currently I'm starting a film about a Middle East journalist, a British guy named Robert Fisk. And he's been reporting in the Middle East for 40 years, and he's very savvy with cameras. He knows how things work like that, and he's really off the cuff. And for this approach, I'm really going to carry the camera and just tether myself to him, and not like try to do a lot of pre-lighting and things like that. I just have to be on the ready, and it's much more run and gun. And I think it suits his character.
Sure.
You know, and the sort of things like that. That's how I've been thinking about it lately.
Okay. That's great. Thanks. I want to ask you, so you mentioned this, I mean, there's a lot of the film that's verite, which is observational for those of you who haven't figured out that word yet. And there's a lot of it, I mean, but you're also interviewing them, and you're also bringing in your own story, your own personal story through narration, and your grandfather's story. And then there's even a little archival, a little historical thing. Did you ever, I mean, I think you found a really sweet spot for where all those things fit in and how they all interconnect. But that seems like it may have been a real challenge to figure that out and to make those choices. I mean, were you
I think
planning on bringing in your grandfather and your own personal story into it, or did that come along later? Or
that was the first. That narrative structure was the first pass on it. I think later, as we were getting close to the first rough cut or something, we tried a version where we just tried to make it purely verite, where we didn't have any of the narration, any of the additional layers.
Right.
And it felt like there was a lot of context in 2008. You know, the release date of the film, just around the corner from the Beijing Olympics. You know, when the film came out, I think it kind of fit also in this place where you know, Westerners didn't know much about China, and China was trying to make a big, you know, premiere of their new country. And so I think there were a lot of questions about what was going on there at the time. And I think I wasn't consciously trying to fill those blanks in, but I think there was this idea of, like, at the time, like, just kind of filling in the gaps of what was happening in that place. And people, I think, felt like, from what their knowledge of China was at the time to that time, it was you know, markedly different. People are generally shocked when they go, at the time when they would go to China, you know, and see that it's a very modern city with so much contradiction. But so yeah, I think we found that,
you know, it's not to interrupt you, but the one woman who said, or the man who says, I was surprised at how big the cities were. I was like, what, you know? But now that you mention it,
yeah, there was, you know, a lot of these, you know, everyday people would come into the country on this and expect to see something, and that something was maybe 1 billion people riding bicycles.
Oh, did we lose you?
Yeah. Oh,
we lost you for a second there.
I was saying that you know, in 2008, people were expecting to see you know, 1 billion Chinese riding bicycles in Mao suits, and that really isn't what it was like at the time. And I think that was shocking to a lot of people. And so I found like the narrative will help to guide the audience a little bit.
Yep, we keep losing you there, Yung. Hope he's not gone. Oh, yep, you're back.
I'm here.
Yeah, good. Yeah, this is a little different than what we're doing in the test. It's like we don't hear you, it just stops. So, are you here still? Because you were back for a second, now you're gone again. I don't want to disconnect because I'm recording it. Are you back? No?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, now I can hear you. Could you hear me during all that?
Yes, I could. I'm just going to send a message out to my my lovely wife, who is probably using some of the data we have here. She's a adjunct professor, and she's in Connecticut, and she's doing an online course, and she's probably using some. Hold on, let me just let her know. Video bandwidth. Okay, sorry about this, audience. Is it all right now?
Yeah, it is. It's a little fuzzy, your image, but that comes and goes. So, all right. So let me move on from that. We talked about that. So there were certain choices that you made based on informing the audience of a decade ago. That the Western audience that just wasn't up to speed with China at all, really. Not like we are still, but
no, it's true. It still is a little bit. People are still fascinated, obviously, by this big place. Yeah. So I felt like having that layer of my voice would aid in the guide process, you know, kind of guiding the audience a little bit, but also hopefully layering things a little bit more. How complex, you know, history is. My family was torn apart in the Civil War in China, and we had to immigrate. And then history of China is about this, and you brought it up earlier when we were talking about dislocation and and immigration and migrant, you know, the migrant path, and specifically in China is such a big thing. You know, it's a sweeping edict by the government can move 1 million people, you know, and because it's for the betterment of society, so to speak. But so you know, there was all of that going through me when I was making the film.
Yeah, there's a wonderful interview with the shopkeeper. It's just like, you know, heartbreaking, and how he starts to talk about, oh, this is for the good of the larger family, and sort of the party line, and then you're able to get his you know, to kind of get him to go a little deeper. Did that happen naturally, or is there something? What is your advice to young filmmakers when they're interviewing people?
Yeah, that's a good question. That did happen. It happened very naturally. I'm trying to flash back to the moment. My advice would be, as you know, that's I think classic interviewing technique 101, which is mostly just letting the interviewee express themselves and just be a really good listener. I don't think we said. I said one. I said nothing almost. I may have asked a very simple question. A very simple question, like, do you want to relocate? I think it might have been that question, and then just being attentive and being a friend, you know, and trying to connect with somebody, and you know, obviously, there's also, I would say, there's like 50% the magic of what a camera does when it's around. You know, it really, for some reason, often acts like a mirror, and people just kind of open up and they talk. I found that is most of the time really happens for me. The setting also was quite dramatic. I mean, just outside, literally, there was some rioting about to happen, or you know, tension in this little city as it was being torn down. So all of that culminated into that moment, and those are those kind of magical moments, I guess, that we all strive for as filmmakers, as documentarians. They're very truthful moments. I was talking to the producer of Up the Yangtze at the time, and he had instructed me, you know, all you need are 3 really powerful moments, and then you can construct your film around that. I don't know if that's true or not, but that particular interview with the antique owner was something that I filmed in a research shoot. It wasn't even really part of the final film. That was not shot on the Panasonic P2 camera. That was shot actually on the BD-150. So you know, it just, sometimes the good material just happens, and you have to try to capture as much of the moment as possible. And you know, I think I think for interviewing, it's a certain skill, but it's actually takes practice. But I think it's about being as quiet as possible, not saying too much.
That's great advice. I'm going to ask one more question and turn it over to these folks who can just comment.
Are they still awake?
If you have questions. Oh yeah, they're listening pretty awake. And that is the whole edit and the vibe of the film. I would say is very hypnotic. You know, it's mesmerizing, and there's a tone to it that you create from early on. And I just think your final sequence is just so perfect, especially your young protagonist, Cindy.
Cindy, yeah.
She that last shot of just her in bed, listening to the sound of the boat or the ship, and then that last shot going into the I don't know if it's a lock or the gate.
Yeah, it was a lock. It was a lock into the Three Gorges Dam.
Right. Yeah. And your just choice to just hold on those shots for so long. Tell me about making that choice. Was it like, oh, this is how I want to do it, or was it kind of scary? I mean, it seems like Right.
I think it's weird how filmmaking works. You know, there's like there's a lot of combination of elements that make things work in the end. I think initially, you know, something that I like to do when I make my films is write a very detailed sort of script without dialogue, sort of maybe more like a treatment. But for me, it's like it reads like a kind of a treatment / checklist / outline.
Right.
And in it, I'll kind of outline the scenes and images that I want to film and things like that. There's always the idea of starting with
before you shoot.
Before I shoot, way before, you know.
Yeah.
I think it's really helpful to do a lot of writing in advance after you've researched and processed, because it helps to solidify the themes, and then you can actually, for me, very usefully, you get the themes kind of embedded in you. And then you kind of chuck it out the window, because I think it's more important to concentrate on the story and the visuals, and because you've kind of like things just kind of stick in your subconscious. I think you train your camera in places that kind of fit in the end to what you're going for. So for me, it was always this kind of apocalyptic, this tour, and sort of, like Apocalypse Now, like a river
Sure.
tour,
Yeah, sure.
And there was always the idea of the gates opening and closing, and so I think that always stuck, beginning to bookend the film. And the second part was just that collaboration with my editor, Hanale, who's remarkable. She's a Finnish Canadian editor, immigrant from Finland, and works at the National Film Board of Canada, and just had the sensibility to find the images that I'd shot, and get together the sequence that I was thinking about, and to use the shot of Yushui Cindy looking out, and then that was something that was filmed out of context, obviously, but she found a way to put it in the narrative fold and hold on the gates, and then the layering of the picture edit with the music was crucial, I think, as well, and that somehow all just coalesced into a thing. And
yeah.
I don't know, you know how it is, it's a little weird sometimes.
That's just magic, and you can't control it.
You can't control it. Yeah, it's just weird how it happens.
Yeah, works great. Works great. There is actually a nice little line here, so
good.
Let them at you. And please tell them your name before you start.
Hello, I'm Matt Darden, film student here. I really enjoyed the Cindy Yu and her family and kind of following their story. I was wondering, was it difficult to find and decide on that family and kind of follow them through the damming of the river? Because I know there were 2 million people that have different stories. Was that challenging? And how did you find that family?
Yeah, it was really hard, and that particular, I had some, casting is such a big part of the documentary filmmaking, and if you don't have a good character, then you may as well, in the traditional sense, it's hard to make a good film out of that if it's not a strong character that you can see will have this kind of arc. And I think in this process, in our process, you kind of gamble a little too. You throw your chips down and hope that this one sticks. But for my process, I tried 5 different characters, and I had some criterion that I was looking for when I was, let's just, for lack of a better word, just casting. I needed at least someone who was being forcibly relocated because of the rising water. I needed them to move in the next quarter that I was filming. So it all came down to like a handful of people in the end. There was a few from some smaller city nearby. Actually, Jerry was one of them, and Cindy Yu is the other one. And they all came in for this interviewing process on the ship where they were trying to get a job. And Yushui came in and she did the interview, and I would just have this, working with the recruitment process, I would have the sheets and I would be able to see where people were from and if they were being moved. And then I would later go back and I would visit them in their hometown, in their village, or wherever. And obviously finding Yushui living on the banks of the river was quite striking, and it's certainly, I wanted it to work. So I talked to the family, and it just seemed like it was all good to go. Now let me tell you that like the process of documentary filmmaking is really touch and go. Like at some moment, the subject may just decide not to be filmed, and there's a lot of massaging and trust building that you have to do, and so we were trying to be as close as and participatory with the family as possible, and that's something that was very important for us.
So my follow-up question to that is, do you know how Cindy Yu and her family are doing now?
Yeah, I'm in touch with them, and constantly release.
You're kind of breaking up a little bit.
Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, now we can.
So I'm still in touch with the family, and especially Cindy. And after we released the film in 2008, it traveled the country and was released theatrically. And through that process, I would go to screenings and we would raise money for the family. And we raised like $60,000 for them. And I just, like about a year ago, paid the final installment to them. And they were using the money to help put the children through school. And it turns out Yu Shui, about just after the film was released, she decided to pursue a technical degree studying accounting in Chongqing, the city. So she did that, and over the past 10 years, it's a remarkable story. She finished college, she worked in a hotel, she met a boy, she got married. And I've been following all this, and I recently went to see her maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, when she came to see my next documentary I had made in 2012 about Chinese boxing. And she was there at the screen. It was very surreal to have two of my main subjects meet each other from two different films in the same city. So the family's doing quite well. I know the father's health isn't excellent. He suffered a stroke, but he's. I think the money we've been able to raise for them has helped a lot. They've moved consequently again to a new part of the town, and are living in a new apartment. And the two younger siblings are doing well too. The youngest daughter, I think, is really doing awesome. She's smart and is in college. Things are good. I think things are good.
Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
For answering my question. I'll pass the torch.
Thanks, Matt. Hiya.
Hi, I'm sorry. I've kind of like a bit more in that question of what you asked before. You said like you had a casting process for the people, so I guess you paid most of your protagonists?
You know, I followed the journalistic kind of decision not to pay the subjects until the filming was completed and there was ways to remunerate through like fundraising, for example. I think I didn't want to feel like I was controlling the subjects with a payment process. What we would do though is, you know, I'd buy some food, or I'd, you know, get them especially for the Yu family, I would get them the essentials that they didn't have, like rice and oil and things like that. And that was my way of giving back to them for their time. But generally, I think we were really just following their process. So I don't think we were that invasive overall in their timeline. That was my position on that film. I think for films where I'm filming people who are from more difficult backgrounds and situations like that, like the Yu family, I do sort of take a position like this. I don't want to be seen as exploiting in a way through payment. But I always try to build in a way to give back to them later. You know, I think in this day and age now, it really depends on subject to subject, like and film subject to subject. Like, I generally take a policy not to pay my subjects, but find a way to give back another way.
Yeah. So do you know like what their motivation was to take part of your project? Because I feel like often, especially when you're filming like really poor environments, they're like, what are the reasons the people would participate? Even
Yeah,
though
a part of me likes to think that a lot of it is that a camera crew and a film crew has descended upon them, and that we're actually taking interest in their personal life, and that we are invested in the outcome of their life, and that emboldens them and gives them a sort of sense of placement. And I think that was the case with the Yu family and Cindy. Obviously, there are questions of like how much. There is the obvious question that after we finish filming with them, their lives would be changed. Would their lives be changed forever? And yes, it was affected. Their fate was affected. consequently, in other films I've made, I made this boxing film called China Heavyweight, and the subject in that film, his life and his boxing school was entirely changed, probably for the positive, I hope. But you know, there are those kind of questions you have to think about, and I struggle with that too every day. I think about the effects, and obviously as a filmmaker, you want to be morally, you know, and ethically comfortable with your actions, and you have to feel comfortable that after you make a film, there is an obligation to remain kind of tethered and helpful. But then, of course, you know that after 10 years, that connection sort of may not be as close as it was when you started. And so I feel more and more that, you know, I'm kind of getting further away from the observational process of filmmaking, Veritate process, simply because it demands so much relationship connecting, and it's, on the one hand, hard for the filmmaker, on the other hand, affects the subject. And I think in my later films, I've kind of gone more to a more traditional process of filmmaking, which is like an interview and a talking head interview, and you know, like trying to kind of change and adopt a new method. As I age and get older, I feel like I have a different approach.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
Okay. Just checking. Could you tell me what your whole process was to approaching this? Like, how much research did you do? How much time did you spend on the movie in general?
Yeah, on average about 3 years per film. Up the Yangtze, it being my first film, was a little longer, I would say. I could say I've probably, since the cruise trip I went on with my parents, it probably took about 1.5 years, 2 years of research. And there was fundraising, and I had to look for, in Canada, we're maybe a little more fortunate with government support, and I was able to get a grant and research development grant from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and then link up with our National Film Board here, which is sort of like it's a national funding agency, and they produce films, so they help to co-produce the movie. And then a lot of it for me was more in the financing of the film. I knew I had the idea, there was a certain amount of urgency, but then linking up with very good producers, they were able to push the film out and get all this support from international broadcasters like National Geographic in America, PBS in America, and like ZDF Arte in France and Germany, and all sorts of these international people that would put money down as pre-investment into the movie. And then we had a plush budget, and I could go and make the film properly. So that pre-production phase, financing phase, took like 1 year to do, and then there was a 2-year shooting, editing, post-production process. So total about 3 years.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi.
Hey there, I'm Hunter. I have an interviewing technique question. So is there any conscious practice you have or something like that to make people feel more comfortable on camera when they're being interviewed?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, there's a few tips. Maybe they're not new tips. I think you may have heard these before, but one of them is don't have a notebook in front of you and don't read your questions. I think it's much better to be prepared beforehand. Keep a little, maybe like a checklist on a cue card, but try to be off book as much as possible, and try to just engage with the subject eye to eye, and make it feel less formal. I think, that leads me to the next tip, which is make it conversational. Don't make it like question answer back and forth. I think it should feel conversational. I think maybe much to the chagrin of my editors, maybe my interview technique makes it difficult in the editing room, but I try to make sure in the beginning to set up that I need a full answer back from a sentence, you know?
Yeah.
And I'll start in the beginning just to get it in the rhythms. So just so that the subject can understand that, I need to answer in a full sentence. I can't just say, how old are you? And then 18. You can't just do that. You need to say, I am 18. So I make sure that I get that going. Once that's going, I kind of let it become more meandering and conversational. I make sure that the subject feels like it's okay to misanswer or stumble or, say things that aren't quite right, because you can tell them that you'll just fix it in the editing later. Just don't worry, I think timing is important. Like if the subject is older, you don't want to waste their time when they're tired. You want to find their optimal time to interview them. And so that's important. Location, I think, there's a difference when you bring someone into a studio versus keeping them in their house, somewhere where they're familiar with. I think you get a different interview out of that. I think that's something. I think, Errol Morris has this amazing Interrotron device that he has, which is like you should look it up if you don't know about it. It's like he has a mirror where it shows his face, which is in front of the camera lens. So it actually makes it look like the subject is looking directly into the camera, but he's looking at Errol Morris. And apparently that helps make the subjects feel more comfortable and conversational. I've never tried it. I don't know if Errol Morris has patented that technology, but it's has he?
No.
But anyone can make it up. You can look for it online. There's tips on how to do that. But generally, there's nothing like just, I think another thing I like to do is have a long lens on the camera so that I can be further back. The camera can be further back, and I can sit closer to the subject. Do you know what I mean? So there's not all this intimidation. I've always found that even having a generally, my crew is usually maximum 5 people, doesn't seem to affect the subject too much as long as you're focused. I think there's a lot of pre-interview warm-up where things are being set up, the subject is in position, and you're starting the conversation already. You're chit-chatting and you're making them comfortable, getting used to the space. And if there's lights, they're getting used to the lights, and then you bring in the interview. You just kind of you don't tell the cameraman action, you don't make it feel intimidating. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And then how soon do you start filming? Are you worried you'll miss something important during the warm-up, or?
It's not so much the beginning. To me, it's more about letting the camera roll at the end. Usually there's, 110% of the time the subject has something to add at the end.
Okay. So
it's just giving, I think, being that silent aspect of just nodding and listening and engaging with your your body and I think really encourages more talk. So I think it's usually at that final moments that are I think pretty revealing. And I think it's how you time and pace your questions. You don't want to let everything out at once. You want to just kind of build up to it and work your way into that kind of stuff. The big questions.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Young, it looks like we have 3 people with questions. That sound about good for you?
Yeah, that's great. Sorry, I'm a little long-winded, I think, maybe. Sorry, maybe I'll keep them shorter.
Long-winded is better than short-winded.
So I'm Kurt. I have a couple questions. One of them, when, I know her name is Cindy, but when she commented to her mom, that kind of harsh thing at the beginning, and there was that moment where the family was kind of in that awkward, not wanting to talk phase. How was that on as filming, and then how was that with the family? How did they respond to the cameras filming that?
Okay, so that moment, they weren't, when they're in the heat of it, they're not even aware of the camera, and so that, that's pretty valuable. For as a filmmaker, that's pretty valuable stuff, and and obviously the irony is that you're working for those kind of emotional moments, and yet it you know, it can be uncomfortable for them. But I think because we had developed that relationship with everyone, that they felt comfortable just you know, building up to those moments. It's a, you know, there's so much in terms of Cindy's life going on that the pressure just had to, you know, release itself at some point, and that was that one of those moments. For us, you know, the crew and the aftermath of a moment like that is, just trying to think of other moments that I've gotten in the past that can be, I mean, I think the key is for us, it was just to be very respectful and not try to, you know, not try to play psychologist or something like that. I think there's certainly, I think it's important to be like a friend. I think for me as a filmmaker, it's not like there's not a demarcation between a journalist. I'm not a journalist, so I may take some journalistic, you know, processes in my filmmaking, but I'm just trying to be a filmmaker, and I'm trying to be a friend to the subjects. So, you know, in those moments where it's uncomfortable, I think it's okay to go in and just say, hey, you know, you just have a little conversation, try to make things comfortable and just be respectful. You know what I mean? I don't think, I try not to be too dogmatic about, you know, like, no, you shouldn't be, you know, you shouldn't say that to your mom or something like. I don't do that.
Yeah.
So,
and then
yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's it. Yeah.
And my second question, like on the boats when there's a ton of people there, how did you handle that? Like, did you let people know beforehand that, you know, you're going to be filming, or did you just kind of let it happen?
Yeah, for those big crowd scenes, I usually put a notice up that says you're going to be filmed, and if you don't want to be filmed, tell the film crew, and we would respect that. Generally, just like production-wise, you have to get as many release forms as you can. So we would always, there would be, at the beginning of every cruise, there would be an announcement, and we would say, I'm filming, and we're passing around the release forms if you want to be in the movie. You know, we'd make sure we collect as much as possible, and everyone needs to sign a release form. That's just sort of the rule. So we did that. The other way around that, yeah, that was pretty much it. And, you know, I think because the cruise ship was so repetitive, and you would have, like, at some point I was just like, everyone looked the same to me, and it was, in terms of the tourists, you know, I was like, and it just felt like I was living on that ship. So we could just I felt very comfortable filming above on the main decks. And it seemed to work out okay.
Sweet. Thanks. I love the film.
Thank you.
Damn short.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Marco. So the Three Gorges Dam is kind of a controversial issue, you know, with everybody living there getting kicked out. So have you ever had any complications during your production with the Chinese government, or anything, complications in post?
Yeah, not in post in particular, but during production we had some run-ins, and it was illegal at the time to be filming anything to do with the Three Gorges Dam. So we were quite careful how we handled it. Like, for example, I set up a post-production office in Chongqing. That was our home base, and we, you know, I made sure that the footage we were shooting and the hard drives were backed up like 5 times, and we would, at the time, we could just, and this is 2008, they had DHL, and we had a deal with DHL where we could ship our hard drives out of the country, and we kept two of them with us, one in Beijing and one in Chongqing. Yeah, we had some run-ins, and it got more uncomfortable as we neared the end of production. And there's an anecdote which was kind of crazy, but it happened to be on the cruise ship. We were it was our last week of shooting, and just so happened that the chief of police of the river, of the Yangtze River, was on the ship, and he was getting drunk with the captain, and the captain said that, oh, you know, National Geographic is here filming a documentary on the Three Gorges Dam, and the police chief threw down his glass and his shot glass, and he was like, you know, he was like, what the fuck, you know, these National Geographic are American spies. And you know, we'd been shooting for a year, and it came down to this final moment. He called us into this, we had a sit down in his cabin with the police chief, and he asked us for our IDs, and we had to give him our IDs. He asked us if we had, you know, in China, there's a policy of signing in with the local police station wherever you're living, and we did not do that, obviously. So there was all this heat on us, like, oh shit, this is gonna get nasty. So as soon as we got back to Chongqing, we packed up and we just kind of like got the hell out. Especially the footage. But you know, I was working with a Chinese crew, so they were conscious of trying to protect themselves a little bit. Everything worked out fine in the end, but that was a hairy moment, and it's such a weird story that it ended that way. You know.
Awesome. Well, that's just my one question. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Hi.
Yeah, that's good. Hi. I'm Sai. You mostly just answered my question.
Okay.
But I wanted to ask, so what did you tell people you were doing, and what was like Cindy and Jerry's understanding of what they were taking part in?
Yeah. Well, for Cindy and Jerry, it was more like I'm gonna, you know, I think I presented like I just wanted to follow them. I knew that they were being relocated, and I wanted to just see how their story would develop in the year, you know, and that was pretty much the kind of ask, you know, can I do this with you guys? And I think for these kids, it was quite flattering to have a crew around, especially for Jerry. You know, he's a pretty cocky guy. He in fact, his postscript note is that he tried to become an actor. I think gave that up, but I think he tried to go to acting school after the film came out. Generally, I think when I was talking to people, it was, you know, that I wanted to make a film about the Three Gorges Dam, and I wasn't too. If you were asking, like, was I trying to be careful about how I was presenting it to certain people? Yes, I was, certainly to the Chinese side, government side. You know, this wasn't a film that was made with permission, so it was all under the radar, and we had to be careful. As for the tourists, it was more like, you know, I'm making a film about the dam. It never really came up as a questionable thing. People seemed very supportive, and I think it was really smoothly until that last week we were shooting.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, I have another question. Anyone else? We wrung him dry, and we get more out of him. It's like really late there in Toronto, so I don't want to keep you up. I do want to ask about, you talked about the boat, the ship line, Victoria, I think you said, but I also noticed all the logos, of course, are faded, blurred out. The reason for that? I mean, did you have a?
The Yangtze Cruise Line stuff?
Yeah.
Oh yes, you have that version of. It was a DVD version, right? So
yeah.
I think now I recall that was done. You know, for the theatrical release and everything else, we didn't have to blur anything out. I wonder why that came about in the end. Probably with the legal department. I'm not even aware. I completely forgot that was even done.
Yeah.
I imagine in our Canadian DVD that we didn't do that, so it was only in America. Things must have come up between the cruise line and the release of the film at the time. But I know that the theatrical release was quite well you know, received by the cruise line.
Good.
And I know that they even had copies of the DVD being sold in their gift shop on the boat. So
that's surprising.
you know, yeah, it's really surprising. I just, you know, I don't know. I feel like, you know, who the audiences that came to see the movie, a lot of them were people that were on the cruise ship and that had taken cruise ships on the Yangtze River, and a lot of them we kind of tapped into this niche, like, senior citizen market of film goers, and it did really well for us. I would do Q&As, like I did a Q&A in Buenos Aires at a festival there, and there was a doctor there who was actually glimpsed in the film. He had turned up in this festival, and he was there and had been on the cruise ship. So a lot of things like that happened. It's funny.
Very interesting. Well, this has been wonderful. This has been really great. Your questions and your answers were fabulous. So thank you for sharing the film and spending the time. And it's been really fun to get to know you better and all of our weird connections.
Yeah. I'll see you in Los Angeles, I guess.
Yeah, we'll see you in a week and a half. So everyone, why don't you give them a big hand? And so just thanks so much.
Thank you,
Thanks
everyone.
so much for sharing. So
thanks for having me.
Hope that little one sleeps through the night.
So far, so good.